this jacket has kind of a special history. I've done some patching on it and also had someone else do some patches on it, but it was given to me by a man who was a Vietnam veteran of the Vietnamese War, who later became an alcoholic. And I just think part of my story is that I've been drawn to people who've had these deeply traumatic experiences without really, until recently, acknowledging for myself that my own trauma is, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself because I've had a really unusual life, and it's very difficult to know who to tell and who not to tell. I don't want to feel as if I'm just telling my problems to everybody. And sometimes it's not a problem, but what happened to me as a child still seems to be something I need to focus a lot of healing energy in my life on. And I think that as an adult, my vision to develop a center for the arts and creative renewal actually had its seeds when I was a young child. And I'm going to go into that more, but first I'm going to read several poems. This poem starts with a quote by Octavio Paz from his poem Vrindavan. He's a Mexican poet who is one of my favorite poets. He said, "I am a history, a memory inventing itself. I am never alone. I speak with you always. You speak with me always. I move in the dark. I plant signs." And then this is the poem that I wrote, In the Night of My Heart. In the night of my heart, I hold a place of healing, a sacred place of sojourn, a peaceful setting for pilgrimage. In the midnight moon of my heart, I sense a deeper truth, yearning, growing fruitful, in self-acceptance beyond misunderstanding. I hold this special place, hallowed receptive knowing. And then this is another poem, and what I have been doing for several years is combining my collage art with my poetry. This poem is dedicated to my spiritual master, Meher Baba, and I am just grateful that I've had him in my heart and in my life and studied his writings and met his mandali, his inner circle in India, because he dropped his body in 1969, but in 1995, late 95, I was fortunate to go to India and meet his inner circle, and I feel that some of the challenges that I've faced and the overcoming of these challenges is leading me to be able to give support and encouragement to others. Dancing into Light for Avatar Meher Baba. Dancing in the darkness before dawn breaks, my own breath slowly renewing itself above whispers invisible mountains. Dancing in the light of your intimate love, your grace gives me courage. I know the strength of things unseen. I know the path where none have tread. As I walk this invisible mountain step by step, my feet move beyond invisible boundaries, always dancing in the light of your intimate love. Well, to begin in a kind of roundabout way, I am a trauma survivor from childhood, and for 30 years, this is my 30th year of being totally free of allopathic antidepressants and choosing not to take these to help me with my emotional challenges was a big deal. And in about 1971, I began to look into alternatives because I didn't like the way the drugs made me feel. And of course now the New Yorker and other research has shown that these drugs have negative side effects health-wise on people. Although for some they need to take them, I've been advised by the people in alternative medical field that I am sticking to not taking them. And there has not been a lot of support in society for this sort of thing. I envision that in the future there will be 12-step support programs honoring and supporting and acknowledging people who choose to go the way of the holistic path for emotional balance. However, for me, it was kind of a pioneering thing, and I sometimes wonder what the statistics are for what this is. One of the really significant events in my life in the last several years is that I met Robert Comashane, and he has spent a good deal of his adult life really struggling also with issues of emotional health, and he has actually been in mental hospitals for much of his adult life and lived with his family. I have never been in a mental institution, but Robert has received encouragement from what I have done with my life, and until recently it didn't really hit me that wow, I've been drug-free for 30 years. Well, I'm just going to start with my early childhood because it's significant. My parents were separated when I was about 5 and then divorced, and they had a very bitter animosity between them. It's taken me a long time to kind of put all the pieces together about what happened. And basically, when I was 7.5 years old in 1957, I was asked by my mom one evening to pack my things. She told me I would be going away for a few weeks. And I had been to a summer camp that summer, just a day camp. And so I thought, because I'd spoken with children who'd also gone away to overnight camps, that that was what it was going to be like. And so a woman from what I now know to be the Department of Social Services actually took me out of my mother's home because the home was considered to be having a negative effect on me. And much later, I began to know my parents later on in my 20s as pretty normal people. But at that time, I've actually come to acknowledge that I have been through an experience that is, in its own way, just as horrendous as being in a Japanese internment camp, except nobody was holding a gun on me, but I was taken out of my mother's home and placed in an institution for children from broken homes. Many of these children were quite traumatized and had been in similar situations to my own. However, what was very difficult for me was that I was basically lied to, and this has had a very damaging effect on me, which kind of comes and goes. I was told nothing about what was to happen. What happened was that I was in this institution in Los Angeles, Vista Del Mar, for 2.5 years. On weekends, on Saturdays, we all went to a movie. On Sundays, I was not permitted to visit my parents and to leave the grounds as the other children were. However, we all went to walk to a public school, but it's not like we were prisoners. But on Sundays, I would hang out with some of the older teenagers who also didn't have a place to go, and there were 2 other children my age who often were with me. And I was allowed to see my mother after 3 months. And before that, visits were denied once a week. The other children had phone privileges to call their family. I had no access. I snuck and tried to mail a letter to my mother, but not being very good at that, it was caught because it was mailed in the office of the social worker that I was seeing on the property. Years later, in the early 70s, I went back to visit Vista Del Mar, and it was a lush, beautiful paradise of nature, actually, but until I actually went there in my 20s, I had no memory of that, and may have been. What happened was I stayed in that home for 2.5 years, and after 3 months, my mother was allowed to see me for approximately 10 minutes midweek, and it was pretty much supervised by the social worker who I liked. And then, of course, my father, I guess, complained to the courts and to the Department of Social Services that, well, if Anne, Sharon's mother, is allowed to see her, why can't I? So they changed their policy, and I was allowed to see my mother for 10 minutes once a week. Then they changed it to a half an hour once a week. Then there was 1 week where there was nobody, so I guess I could recover, and then my father for a half an hour. And this was generally done not during the Sundays when the other children went away. So the really sad thing was that the children would come home on Sundays, and they would be usually high energy from having visits with their families, and they kind of became my extended family, but I had no one. And my father, through talking to one of the other fathers there, kind of found out what was going on, and he really raised hell, and he wrote to county officials, government officials, complaining that I was being neglected, which I was. They could have actually had some sort of additional support for me, I think, even if they didn't want me to see my family. And he complained to the extent that they basically kicked me out of there, which I had very mixed feelings about. I had bonded with the children. And I feel that my vision now to establish a center for the arts and self-healing really originated in the experience that I had at Vista Del Mar, which means view of the ocean in Spanish. And I feel that at that time I had a very deep desire to be around people in a way that was creative, to help heal them and to make them happy, especially being around the traumatized children. And at this point in my adult life, I am working on my poetry and art and movement. But a lot of these things, and even singing, are for healing, and also some of my work has been exhibited in art shows and sold, and some of the poems have been published also. Well, what happened was very unusual. The first home was asked me to leave, and the first children's home, and I went to a second one, and it was actually a very nice one, although my mother complained that it was longer drive from Los Angeles. It was out in the country, out in Laverne, California, and it was a farm. And in the 70s, I looked up some of the court reports, and then later in the 90s, I was given my records from Vista Del Mar, and at the end of the report, it mentioned that I was taken to the David and Margaret home, and because of the nature of the second home, I thrived, and there we went to different Sunday schools, and I went to the Jewish temple, and I met Ruth and Michael Robinson. I want to talk a little bit about the reality of Vista Del Mar. It was a home run by the Department of Jewish Philanthropies in Los Angeles, and I really feel that I was neglected there by the establishment and not given the attention that I needed. And it's kind of ironic because in 1990, I called them to get my records, and the first woman I spoke to, which was in the children's infirmary, I guess for some reason that's where our records were, was extremely unfriendly and almost distant. And she said, "Well, why do you want your records?" And I said, "Well, have you ever heard of John Bradshaw?" And I think she had. He's a psychologist who's done tremendous work with his writings and workshops for people healing their inner child and their pain. And that same kind of coldness was there. And we're talking from 1960, when I left the home, till 1990. I felt that same cold institutionalization. And I think that part of what I'm healing now is just being able to feel safe in the world, in my town, in my house, in society, and to heal these old feelings of abandonment and depersonalization, and that if something now is depersonalized, to not take it seriously. These are very deep issues. The second home was a Methodist home. I was the only Jewish child, and it wasn't something that my Jewish Orthodox father really seemed concerned about. He just was concerned. He was so happy that I was finally in a place that I seemed to be doing well, and the visitations got better so that I could see my mother one Sunday and my father the next. And it was really different because the other children's parents came to visit them, so it wasn't, they didn't leave the grounds, so it wasn't as if I was the only one left there. And one of the things that was really interesting is that each child went to a Sunday school of their own denomination. So I went to the Jewish temple, which was in Pomona, California. And I met Ruth Robinson, who sang in the temple chorus at that time, and she and her husband, Rabbi Michael Robinson, began inviting me to their home for the Jewish holidays, and it had been basically 2.5 years since I'd actually seen the inside of a regular house, except that in Vista Del Mar on the Halloween, people who we never knew would sort of open their houses to us. So it was kind of unusual. And in 1960, I was 10. Ruth and Michael had 2 younger children. And basically, I remember that I would visit them sometimes on the weekends, and they would drive me back to Laverne to the David and Margaret home. It was a short drive.
can make that
So,
decision.
so Ruth started crying when they were ready to drop me off. And by the way, I still have photos of myself in these situations. Um, and I asked why she was crying because I actually liked the home. And she said she felt sad that I was leaving. And so shortly after that, I was given a note that I was to see a woman named Mrs. Gage, who was one of the social workers there. And I was called into her office. I was wondering what was going on because I knew I hadn't been naughty or done anything like gotten in a fight or anything. But what happened was, like kids sometimes do, what happened was she said, "Are you ready for a surprise?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "Would you like to move to New York with the Robinsons?" And I had known that he was going to look into getting a pulpit in New York to be a rabbi. And so I immediately said yes. And years later, I sort of wondered about this decision, and I've often wondered what my life would have been like if I hadn't moved to New York with them. But basically, my whole life changed, and 2 years later in '62, they adopted me legally, and I became Sharon Robinson. Now I'm Sharon Lia Robinson. The name Lia I took because I kind of liked the name. I didn't really know there was any meaning to it, but I took that name as my informal middle name, in around 1995. And that was when I was living in Seattle. And at that time I was putting up signs at local food co-ops that I would do part-time childcare. And that's a job that I had from when I was about 12. I took care of the Robinsons' 2 younger children, and then in my 20s and 30s and 40s I actually did that a lot, and I was very good with kids. And then I got kind of burnt out. But this one family, the note had said Sharon Lia, for childcare. They called and they wanted to know if I was related to them. It turns out Lia is a Norwegian name, which means when you are walking up a hill and you come to a plateau before you go on to the next level. And that's what it means. And I actually ended up babysitting for them and learned that they were involved with the Waldorf school, which is something that I've been very interested in studying. And all my life there's these different movements that have paralleled my own work. Like I've done work with movement and dance and poetry, like the Waldorf does the I can't think of the name of their method, but Jungian psychology, different movements. But I've never adopted any of those paths. I've always kind of felt that I'm on my own path because my life's been so unusual. I had felt that I would fit into some lineage, like I would study Tai Chi and become a Tai Chi teacher, or I would study Middle East dance or yoga and follow in somebody else's footsteps. But as Robert Comashane says, it's like he says that he's following in his own footsteps. And so we moved to New York, and I did well, and I didn't really have any problems. But in my late teens, I did have some difficulties. And basically, in my 20s, I needed to, for a while, take antidepressants, and then I got back in touch with my birth parents. We had never really been disconnected, and I had seen my birth mother, I think 2 or 3 times during my teenage years, and my birth father as well. They'd visited in New York. But when I was about 21, I went back to California and I reconnected with my birth mother and my aunt and uncle. And then in 73, I moved back there, and I also met my father's brothers and sisters and reconnected with him. I went back and visited Vista Del Mar. I went to the LA County Courthouse, and I looked up the court records from my early childhood and the bitter embattlements of my family. I also want to say that my birth grandmother was a trauma survivor from the Russian Jewish pogroms, and I feel that it's maybe part of my task to break that cycle where sometimes an adult will pass on to a child or a grandchild their own trauma. And she was abandoned, and she had my uncle, for instance, sent to a military school when he was 4, supposedly for bad behavior. And there was an incident once that my family denies when my aunt on the beach whispered to me, "If you're not good, we're going to send you away." And I was talking to my adoptive father once about this, and he said that family had a history of sending their children away, didn't they? So I did live in Los Angeles for 4 years, and it was very good in the 70s for me. I got involved with the Fat Women's Liberation Movement. We had a problem-solving group, and I also began to feel better about self-image and my body. One thing that was difficult for me was that I'd always been considered a chubby child, and in Los Angeles, the television programs would come to the schools looking for kids to be like on the Art Linkletter children's show, and they would pick children who were not necessarily interested in being on the show, but they would look cute in a socially acceptable way. And so from a very early age, I kind of got the image put down. And even when my mother was divorced from my father and she really needed money, our neighbor, who was a single mother, also told her about the fact that her child had been in a TV commercial, and it was quite a bit of money, not what we would consider a lot, but it was. And my mother took me to an agent, and they said I was too chubby. And so as a child, I wanted to be on those TV shows, but I didn't look right. And so from a very early age in Hollywood, I absorbed those images. And then when I went to live with the Robinsons, there was some concern in that family that I was becoming overweight, which resulted in two things. I became a catalyst for the anthology Shadow on a Tightrope, Writings by Women on Fat Oppression. That began with a series of articles put together by myself and Vivian Mayer in the late 70s, early 80s. Then we couldn't get a publisher, so we let Aunt Loot publishers collect more information and publish it. And this has all been documented, my part in forming that anthology. The name I used during part of my attempt to kind of get a sense of who I am, I used for several years the Hebrew last name of Bas Hana. So I used the name Sharon Bas Hana, which means daughter of Anne. I have a poem in that anthology which has a line, "Your shadow on a tightrope, she's a fat woman." So that's where the title comes from. And I have an article in there on fat women as dancers, and also on some of the prejudices I felt in the human potential movement related to psychology and how psychologists perceive people. But it also kind of affected how I use food myself, and wanting to work more on not feeling deprived and not using food as a way to nurture myself when it's inappropriate. That's what I'm working on now, that I value myself.